Nothing but the identity crisis will also take place because of the impact we call it as Westernization. Because of impact of Westernization. Now initially the caste was called as, we call it as Varna system. ನೋಡಿ ವರ್ಣ ಏನಾಗ್ತಿತ್ತು ಹೋಗ್ತಾ 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 it became jati, it became caste, it became rigid. The concept has been given by M.N. Srinivas. The concept has been given by M.N. Srinivas while studying about which societies? While society, we call it as the Kurd. Abolition of the sati, abolition of, we call it as abolition of the female feticide or child marriages. The next topic, Westernization. It is the next one, the second topic we call it as a part of social mobility. As a part of social mobility, the second topic we call it as, it is Westernization. Now, what do you mean by Westernization? Why we want Westernization? It is, again, while discussing about Westernization, we call it as the introduction. Now, again, introduction includes the three important things: definition, uniqueness, the stats or the facts or examples. Now, definition, what do you mean by definition of Westernization? ಜೋರಾಗಿ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕು. ಮತ್ತೆ ಇಲ್ಲೇ ಮಾತಾಡಲ್ಲ ಅಂತಿರಲ್ಲ, ಮತ್ತೆ ಇಂಟರ್ವ್ಯೂ ಏನ್ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತೀರಾ? ಗುಸ್ಗುಸು ಅಂತೀರ. It is imitating the culture, the values and belief system of which societies? The Western societies. Yes or no? The most important one we call it as, imitation. Imitation of what? Imitation of the culture, the values. Imitation of the culture, imitation of the values, imitation of what? Imitation of the principles which is followed in the West. It is imitating the cultures, values and principles of the West. We call it as Westernization, and a process we call it as Westernization. Now, sir, ಒಂದೊಂದಾಗನ್ನ decode ಮಾಡೋದಾದ್ರೆ, now what culture? Examples, can you give some examples of culture, values and principles? First, now culture andre, it is English medium education. Howdu? It is the first and foremost one. Culture ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನೋಡೋದಾದ್ರೆ, the first and foremost concept we call it as cultural perspective. It is individualism is being given the highest priority. It is individualism is being given highest priority. What about India or Indian cultures? It is Indian cultures gives more priority to the collectivism. More priority is being given to the joint families. Whereas with respect to West, they go for what culture? They go for a culture called as, it is individualism, or we call it as nuclear families. Now, the concept of nuclear families was not prevalent in India, but because of the influence of Western influence or the Western culture, don't you think in the recent times there is creeping up of nuclear families which is taking place majorly in both the urban as well as even rural also? Even in rural also. Yes or no? That is the biggest threat for Indian culture, the Indian values also. Okay, I'll bring you the example. Now, second one, with respect to values, what values we have inculcated from West? What values we have inculcated from West? Example, it is examples which include the first concept called as, it is human rights. The concept of, we call it as, values sir anta kelidre, the concept of human rights. The concept of human rights, and again the concept of, we call it as democratic system. The concept of, we call it as rationality. It is, we can also talk about, it is human rights, and it also includes natural rights also. It is, okay, it is natural right also, or human rights. It is, which includes the value system called as democratic governance or democracy anta. It is democracy. The concept of democracy has been taken up from Elinda, again from the West. Sir, it is nothing but concept of justice, concept of equality, the concept of fraternity, all those things. Sir, aganta namma ಒಂದು society ಇರ್ಲಿಲ್ವಾ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಇತ್ತು, but that was not much prevalent. But this we have inculcated from a concept called as it is Western. Okay, alva? Yes, is Westernization, is it completely bad? Is it completely good? No. It is, see, no concept is good or bad. It depends on who is inculcating it. Haudo ilvo? See, now ketoro. It's not the concept. It's not the concept as such. Now, ನೋಡಿ caste system ಅನ್ನೋದು, it was not bad. But how on caste system ಏನು ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಬರ್ತಿದ್ವಿ? Nothing but we became rigid or we made it rigid. Now, initially the caste was called as, we call it as Varna system. ನೋಡಿ ವರ್ಣ ಏನಾಗ್ತಿತ್ತು? ಹೋಗ್ತಾ it became jati, it became caste, it became rigid. Now, ಅವಾಗ ಅದು bad. But initially during it is early Vedic period, the concept of Varna. Now, the concept of Varna ನೋಡೋದಾದ್ರೆ, it is majorly to check the society and to maintain the stability of society. We have brought in a concept called as Varna. But ಹೋಗ್ತಾ we made that concept bad. Yes or no? Okay alva? It is same concept. ಅದೇ ರೀತಿ patriarchy ನೋಡಿ. Now again, the concept of patriarchy was not bad in the initial times, but we made it bad by oppressing the women. Yes or no? Yes. See, ಅದೇ ರೀತಿ ಎಲ್ಲ concepts. Even the same with respect to Westernization. It is not bad, but we made this concept bad. Okay, along. Yes, and human rights. Now, can you give some principles of we call it as Westernization? The principles of Westernization, we call it as, it is profit-oriented manner, or we call it as a concept of capitalism. The concept of capitalism, concept of materialism. Nothing but it is based on the material beliefs, based on the material holding. Our status is being calculated. Hey, for example, you have ಮನೆಗೆ ಹೋಗ್ತೀರಾ, ಮನೆಗೆ ಹೋದ ತಕ್ಷಣ ನಾರ್ಮಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಹೊಸ ಸೇಫ್ ಸೋಫಾ ಇದ್ರೆ, will you give more priority or ಖಾಲಿ ಇದ್ರೆ ಇಷ್ಟ ಆಗತ್ತ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ? ಏನ್ ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ? It is sofas idre. Now again, all those mindset which has been inculcated from Westernization, nothing but materialism concept, the profit oriented concept, here with increase in corruption cases in administration, it's again a concept of, we call it as the concept of Westernization, nothing but holding more profit. But in Indian society, we does not have a concept called as the surplus profit. Now surplus profit should be shared among the people, and the concept of trustee, it is wealthier should be acting as a trustee for the poor. We need to share. It is the principles which includes major again. It is the capitalistic principles, as well as we call it as the materialism, the concept of the materialism which was prevalent in the West, and that concept has been inculcated in India. Okay, Alva? That's about our first one. The second one we call it as, can you give some examples or some factuals where it is this concept has been inculcated? Now, sir, idella already examples ella barbididivi antandre, now can I introduce a term called as this concept of Westernization has been introduced by yaru? It is again M.N. Srinivas alva. It is this concept has been inculcated by, it is the stats or the facts, it is the concept has been given by M.N. Srinivas. The concept has been given by M.N. Srinivas while studying about which societies? While society, it is, we call it as the Kurg. Again, it is word of Kurg is again English. Westernization. It is ನಮ್ಮ ಒಂದು local language ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇದನ್ನ ಕೊಡಗು ಅಂತ ಕರೀತೀವಿ. ಹೌದೋ ಇಲ್ವೋ? Yes, but again Kurg. It is the Britishers ಗೆ ಕೊಡಗು ಅನ್ನೋದು, it is ಜಾಸ್ತಿ lengthier. It is ಬಾಯಿ ತಿರುಗ್ತಿರ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ. ಏನಕ್ಕೆ ಕೂರ್ಗ್ ಅಂತ. Again, that has become popular now. That has become the popular now. Okay, it is the Kurg while studying about it is Kodugu societies. It is the M.N. Srinivas, the Mysore Narayana Srinivas has given a concept called as both Sanskritization as well as Westernization concept. Okay, sir, idella ನನಗೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗಿದ್ರೆ, now can you give some examples of, or we call it as some uniqueness about this concept of Westernization? What can be the uniqueness? Now the uniqueness here is, can I see Westernization, it is both positive and negatives. Nothing but it has, we call it as, it is both beneficial for Indian society as well as well as it comes with what? It comes with few cons also. It comes with few challenges also. Now, what challenges? If it is challenges, now what challenges? The challenges major are not other. It is degradation of our local culture will take place. Degradation of our local culture will take place. Sir, example, the example which includes the joint families, followed by the second one, we call it as it is protection of the belief systems with respect to Hinduism, the belief system with respect to Islam, it is followed by Jainism, all those things. Now, this has been replaced with a dominant culture called as, we call it as Westernization. We call it as Westernization. So, Westernization, sir, it is concept with respect to all the things. Our beliefs, our mindset. But when Westernization got influence, nothing but we got converted into atheist. Atheist andre nothing but devaru bhakti ne illa. First, alina shuru agate. Second one, we call it as, it is the belief system with respect to culture. It is, we don't respect now the patriarchy. We don't respect any caste system, or we don't respect, we call it as the elders also. The concept of individualism has grown. Now, individualism grow agirodrinda. Now, again, the catalyst act ಮಾಡಿರೋದು. It is English system, English education. Now, English education acted as it is the booster with respect to our loss of beliefs. Nothing but I'm getting employment in the form of education. It is education, English ಮಾಡಿರೋದ್ರಿಂದ I'm getting employed. Now, with employment, I'm getting salaries. Now, with salaries, I'm independent. With salaries, I'm independent. Will I value any social beliefs? Will I value any social cultures? Nothing but I will start to live like a individual or the sole organism rather than living as a society or community. Again, all this has a challenge, but the concept called as Westernization. The concept called as Westernization. Okay, now. Yes. Now, it is the introduction. The second one we call it as, now what factors led to bringing change with respect to Westernization? And what factors led to bringing change? Karanagalennu for inculcation of the concept of Westernization. Okay, perfect. It is, we can't say imposition, it is contact with colonial rulers. Okay, in simpler manner, the first one we call it as the contact with the colonial masters or the colonial rulers. The colonial rulers. Now, if I'm contacting it with the colonial rulers adaga, will I inculcate my own concept to the colonial rulers, or will I inculcate the colonial cultures? Inagate. Namdu na avaru kortiya, avaru namak kortiva. Nothing but we'll automatically take their own culture. Why? Because Western culture is considered to be the dominant culture compared to Indian culture. Haudo illo? Now, now, sir, the contact with the colonial masters brought what all changes? The first one we call it as, which brought the biggest change in the form of education. Howdo it is, we call it as education was being given in the form of what? English education. Howdo, baribodo. It is, we call it as, it is the change with respect to, it is education in our language. Education in English. Second one, it is second one we call it as administration was also been happening in a language called as English. Okay, next, the second major important one we call it as, it is inculcation of the value systems of West. Now, what value system? The value system of West Indian sir and the Keladre. It is the values which includes, it is equality among gender, it is human rights again, concept of sati, abolition of sati, the concept of widow remarriage, the concept of female feticide, all the things which have been brought in by the colonial masters. Yes or no? The different values has been brought in. Now the major value yadu sir anta kelidre, the concept called as equality. Now with equality, we came out with a concept called as abolition of the sati, abolition of, we call it as abolition of the female feticide or child marriages. Third one, we call it as widow remarriage has been. It is widow remarriage has been encouraged. Widow remarriage has been encouraged. Exactly, yes. Exactly. How do? At the first and foremost, the factors. The second one, the second major important one, along with the contact with the colonial masters, even technology has also brought in change. Even technology. Now, what type of technology which has brought in change? That in the recent times only. It is colonial, I can say the colonial masters, it is influence of media, influence of social networking. Yes or no? It is influence of media, influence of the social or the mass medias, the social networking has brought in the concept of westernization, inculcation of Western concept. Now, when inculcation of Western concept, example kodtira. Now, pakka inculcate ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ sir ಅಂತ. Now, the concept of media as well as social networking has brought in the inculcation of the concept called as it is change in dressing sense. How do you know? It is from the saris to we have moved towards what? As we have moved towards the jeans culture or the traditional, I can say, dresses to the modern cultures. Adhiriti with respect to traditional cultures in the, we have moved towards what? We have moved towards the modern, the food cultures. Nothing but the concept we call it as, it is McDonaldization, or we call it as McDonald cultures have inculcated. And this process we call it as, it is a Western culture. The Western process has been inculcated even with respect to our food cultures also. And with respect to the third one we call it as, it is the fast food traditions have also been inculcated. The fast food traditions are ready-made foods. The ready-made foods are being inculcated via the influence of what? Media. Sir, ishtena sir andre innu bejanidave. Nothing but night outs, followed by the pub culture, followed by it is consuming of alcohols. It is Saturday and Sunday adre gottalla. Nothing but it is all that comes under, we call it as the pub culture, or we call it as impact of globalization, impact of media, impact of technology, impact of social networking on the indigenous population, or it is the local population which is bringing in what? The change. Yes or no? Second one we call it as, second one with the influence of media, with the influence of social networking, which has brought in a change called as, with respect to what change? It is the change with respect to food, the change with respect to the dressing, the change with respect to the concept of marriage, the live-in relationships. It is live-in relationships, the concept with respect to family, the concept with respect to the family system. Family andre, it is single mother or the single parents have included or for increased. Inter-country marriages, inter-caste marriages have increased, followed by we call it as, it is live-in relationship has also increased, Now along with the things, okay, technology has also had an influence. Technology jotege, even though globalization has also had an impact. Now how globalization has an impact with respect to the, it is inculcation of Western, the cultures, beliefs and thoughts. Now globalization impact agata. Now globalization has also brought in, it has a concept called as innovation, rational thinking, democratic processes. Yes or no? It is impact of globalization. Now India's globalization which majorly took place after 1991, after LPG reforms. After LPG reforms, the concept of the privatization has increased, the concept of rational thought process, the concept of innovation, has increased. Has increased in the present times na ಕರೀತೀವಿ. ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ ಹೋಗ್ಲಿ? Yes or no? Yes. ಇಲ್ಲ ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಕತೆ ಕೇಳಿಸ್ಕೊತಾ ಇದ್ದೀರಾ? It is the contact, the first initial step, the initial step which has been taken up by the Britishers. Taken up by the Britishers. Now this Britishers initially impacted it is elites. Initially which has impacted the elites, and now this elites, it is elites ನೋಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಏನು ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ವಿ? We started to imitate. We started to imitate the concept of the elites, and the concept we call it as Westernization. But this continued with the help of it is we call it as technology. But final peak reach agada yaವಾಗ? Finally which reached the peak during the globalization period. Now what is globalization? Okay, compared to other nation. Okay, it is globalization ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ it is as simple as that. It is interaction between one country with other country. It is free and fair without any borders. Sir, free and fair with respect to ಏನೇನು? With respect to people, movement of people is easier. Second, with respect to investment, it is investing in India and India investing in outside the countries. It is easier. And the third one we call it as the trade. Export and import becomes easier. Now globalization outcome ಏನು ಸರ್ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳಿದ್ರೆ establishment or integration of the economy with the outside world, and that leads to formation of a global village concept. Globalization andre as simple as that. It is India becoming it is important player at the global level, and that concept we call it as globalization concept. Yes or no? Yes. Now globalization time only it got a clear peak. A peak called as with inculcation of dressing, the food sense, followed by the pub culture, followed by marriage institution, family. All these things got an influence, and all this has been inculcated from a concept called as what? It is Western societies. Okay, now very good. It is Western literatures. ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಬರುತ್ತೆ ಸರ್ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಇಲ್ಲ, it is nothing but it is majority the novels, the majority the poets or the poems, the majority the stories, the friction, non-friction ಇವು ಬರ್ತಿದವಲ್ಲ, all this are being inculcated. Or we call it as influencing the Western cultures. See, majority ನಮ್ಮ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಹಾಳಾಗೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಲಿಟರೇಚರ್ ಕಾರಣ. Nothing but majority they prefer what? It's English education. Okay ಅಲ್ವಾ? ನಾರ್ಮಲಿ ಹ್ಯಾರಿ ಪಾಟರ್ದು ಈ ಹ್ಯಾರಿ ಪಾಟರ್ ಇಲ್ಲಿ inculcate the concept of it is ಎಲ್ಲಾದ್ರೂ ಲವ್ ಸ್ಟೋರಿ. ಆ ಲವ್ ಸ್ಟೋರಿ ಏನು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಬಿಟ್ವೀನ್ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಫಾರಿನರ್ಸ್ ಎಲ್ಲದ್ರಲ್ಲೂ. ಆಟೋಮ್ಯಾಟಿಕಲಿ ಇಫ್ ಐ ಆಮ್ ರೀಡಿಂಗ್ ದಟ್, ಡೋಂಟ್ ಯು ಥಿಂಕ್ ಐ ವಿಲ್ ಗೆಟ್ ಇನ್ಫ್ಲುಯೆನ್ಸ್? ಹಿಂಗೆ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತ. Yes or no? It is so much we have inculcated the concept called as Westernization. It is ಮಾತಾಡ್ಬೋದು. See, Asiatic society is normally it is not with respect to English education. It is conserving our own traditions. ಅದು ಬರಲ್ಲ. It is we add, it is ASI also, Archaeological Survey of India. We have ನಮ್ಮ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ we have Oriental libraries. Now all these are majorly with respect to culturing of, it is conserving of our own traditions rather than the West. But ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಏನಾಯ್ತು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ they started to conserve in our own language. It is ಇದನ್ನ ಕೋಡಿಫೈ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಹೆಂಗ್ ಕೋಡಿಫೈ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ವಿ? We were codifying in English. But ಈ ಕೋಡಿಫೈ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ, don't you think they'll add some masala of the West? Yes or no? Again, that is influence. ಈಗ ಫಾರ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್, ಈಗ ಮಹಾಭಾರತ, ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಒರಿಜಿನಲ್ ಮಹಾಭಾರತ ಓದಿದ್ರೆ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಏನನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ? ಒರಿಜಿನಲ್ ಸಿಗತ್ತೆ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ. ಬಟ್ ಅದೇ ಈಗ ಮಹಾಭಾರತ ವಿಚ್ ಇಸ್ ಬೀನ್ ರಿಟರ್ನ್ ಬೈ ಇಸ್ಕಾನ್ ಓದಿದ್ರೆ ಹೆಂಗಿರುತ್ತೆ? ನಥಿಂಗ್ ಬಟ್ ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಮಹಾಭಾರತದಲ್ಲಿ ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ದ ಕೃಷ್ಣ ವಿಲ್ ಬಿ ಹೈಲೈಟೆಡ್. ನಾರ್ಮಲ್ ಆಗಿ ಮಹಾಭಾರತ ಸ್ಟೋರಿ, ದೇ ವಿಲ್ ರಿಪೀಟ್ ದ ಸ್ಟೋರಿ. ಬಟ್ ಅದೇ ಇಸ್ಕಾನ್ ಮಹಾಭಾರತ ಓದಿ, ನಥಿಂಗ್ ಬಟ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಕಡೆ ಕೃಷ್ಣ, ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಇಂದ ಎಂಡಿಂಗ್ ವರೆಗೂ ಕೃಷ್ಣನ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆನೇ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಿರ್ತಾರೆ. ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಇನ್ಫ್ಲೂಯೆನ್ಸ್ಡ್ ಬೈ ಇಸ್ಕಾನ್. ಅದೇ ರೀತಿ if it has been written by our local rulers, automatically it will be our own cultures. But if it has been codified by Britishers, nothing but automatically there will be influence of the West. And that concept we call it as the concept of Westernization. Now Westernization concept was not a sudden process, rather it was a gradual process which took place in a gradual manner, in an evolutionary manner, and that we call it as concept of Westernization. The concept of Westernization. Okay, now So ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗಿದೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ now the concept of westernization, what are the characteristic features of westernization? What are the third one? We call it as characteristic features, or we call it as the salient features of we call it as the westernization. Try ಮಾಡ್ರ ಬೇಬೇನ್ ಈಗ ಹಿಂಗೆ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕು ಕಾನ್ಸೆಪ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ವೆಸ್ಟರ್ನೈಸೇಷನ್ ಕ್ಯಾರೆಕ್ಟರಿಸ್ಟಿಕ್ ಫೀಚರ್ಸ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ. Now the first one here is the first and the foremost one. Now we will be inculcating the cultures from Elinda. It is first one. Okay ಅಲ್ವಾ? ನೋಡಿ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ರೆಡಿ ಮಾಡಿ ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ ನೋಡೋಣ ಏನು ಡಿಸ್ಕಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಾ ಅಂತ. ಓಕೆ ವೆಸ್ಟರ್ನ್ ನನಗೂ ಗೊತ್ತು, ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಏನು ಗೊತ್ತು? Don't you think you should be more specific with respect to content? Now try ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ, ಯೋಚನೆ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ. The first one is the culture Elinda. The second one, now is this process, and I can say within society imitation or outside? Is it internal influence or external influence? It is the second one, we call it as external. The second one we call it as influence. The third one, is it voluntary inculcation or is it is the force? It is ನೀವೇ ನೋಡಿ. It is we call it as inculcation. We call it as inculcation. ನೀವೊಂದು ಡೈಮೆನ್ಷನ್ ಹೇಳಿ, ನೀವೊಂದು ಎರಡು ಡೈಮೆನ್ಷನ್ ಹೇಳಿ ನೋಡೋಣ. ಸರಿ, ಈ ಡೈಮೆನ್ಷನ್ ಬರೀಬಹುದು ಅಂತ. It is the fourth one, we call it as, what is the outcome here? What is the outcome? ಏನಪ್ಪ outcome ಇಲ್ಲಿ? The outcome we call it as, it is imposition of dominant culture. Imposition of, we call it as dominant culture ಅಂತ. ಓಕೆ ಅಲ್ವಾ? ನೋಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬರೋಣ. Yes. Now with respect to first one, we call it as, and Bevenigam, going to discuss one by one. Now the first one we call it as, it is what type of culture is being inculcated here? The concept of, we call it as external influence in them. We have inculcated the concept of what? The concept of the Western societies, or we call it as dominant caste or dominant societies. Dominant societies. Example ಕೊಡ್ತೀರಾ? ನಾವು ಡಿಸ್ಕಸ್ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಬಿಟ್ಟು, where we have inculcated the concept of westernization, culture of West. ಟ್ರೈ ಮಾಡಿ. ಆಯ್ತು, ಆಲ್ರೆಡಿ ನಾನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟೆ. ಓಕೆ, ಬರ್ಡೇ ಸೆಲೆಬ್ರೇಷನ್ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಬೋದು. ಓಕೆ, ಬೇಡ ಅದು. ಓಕೆ ಅವೆಲ್ಲ ಬೇಡ, ಬಟ್ give me some, it is authentic information. So all that comes under pub culture. It is linguistic. What linguistic? English ಆಯ್ತಲ್ಲ. Dominance of English. Okay ಆಯ್ತು. Online fast. Okay. Leisures, the pop culture. Okay ಅಲ್ವಾ? Now sir, now culture ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನೋಡೋದಾದ್ರೆ, it is the culture called as materialism or materialistic culture got a boost. It is ಯಾವ ಒಂದು ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಸರ್ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳಿದ್ರೆ, it is materialism as well as the consumeristic behavior. The materialistic as well as the consumeristic behavior has been inculcated from the, it is West. Yes, we already inculcated that cultural individualism, leisure, pop culture ಎಲ್ಲ ಆಗಿದೆ. Okay ಅಲ್ವಾ? It is the concept of materialism. Materialism ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಏನಿಲ್ಲ, nothing but more, I can say, preference is being given to the material worth, material which we are holding it. And the second one we call it as concept of consumerism ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ nothing but the holding of surplus resource also. The surplus resources. The concept of, it is now Vedic civilization ಈ ತರ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ. Nothing but we gave more preference to the culture rather than materialism. We gave more importance to culture. Second one, rather than giving more preference to the surplus resources, it is we gave more importance to the sharing of resources. The sharing of resources. Okay. Second one, influence is it within society or outside society? It is outside, and that concept we call it as external influence. And that concept we call it as external influence. External influence. Now, external influence, major influence ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಾ ಯಾವ್ದಾದ್ರು ಹೇಳ್ಪ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಬೋದು. It is major, we call it as, it is European style of architecture, paintings ಮಾತಾಡ್ಬೋದು, music also ಮಾತಾಡ್ಬೋದು. It is example which we can also talk about. It is architecture. Now, which architecture? It is European architecture. Example could European architecture here. It is the churches. It is, we call it as, can you give some unique church? It is the Gothic architecture, followed by the Bomb Jesus architecture in Govadali, the Bomb Jesus Santa, the Bomb Jesus architecture. All this, sir, idikinta important ಗೊತ್ತಿರಲೇಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ Rashtrapati Bhavan. It is Rashtrapati Bhavan. Again, it's an architecture. It's an architecture related to what? It is European styles. ಮಾತಾಡ್ಬೋದಾ? Yes. ಸರ್ ಬರಿಬೋದಲ್ಲ, I'm not saying ಬರಿಬಾರ್ದು ಅಂತ, ಬಟ್ ಹಂಗ್ ನೋಡೋದಾದ್ರೆ ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಮೊದಲಿಂದ ಇತ್ತು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಕುಸ್ತಿ ಆಟ ಅಂತ. ಕುಸ್ತಿ ಇತ್ತು ಮೊದಲಿಂದ, ಎಲ್ಲ ಇತ್ತು. ಓಕೆ ಅಲ್ವಾ? ಬಟ್ ಒಂದ್ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಮಾಡಿಫೈ ಆಗಿದೆ, ಬಟ್ ವಿ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಸ್ಪೆಸಿಫಿಕಲಿ ಸಿ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ ಕಾನ್ಸೆಪ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಅಂತ. ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ದ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಒನ್ ವಿ ಕಾಲ್ ಇಟ್ ಆಸ್ ಇನ್ಫ್ಲುಯೆನ್ಸ್. ನಾವು ಎಕ್ಸ್ಟರ್ನಲ್, ಎಕ್ಸ್ಟರ್ನಲ್ ತುಂಬಾ ಇನ್ವೈಟಿವ್ ಆಗ್ಬಿಡ್ತೀರಾ ನೀವು, ಹೌದಾ ಇಲ್ವೋ? ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಅದೆಲ್ಲ, ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಕ್ವೆಶನ್ಸ್ ಬರಿಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಯು ಶುಡ್ ರೈಟ್ ಇಟ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ. Now it should be more valid. So, for example, it is, if I'm talking about architecture, if I'm talking about painting, automatically I can talk about oil painting ಬಗ್ಗೆ ರಾಜಾ ರವಿವರ್ಮ ಕಾನ್ಸೆಪ್ಟ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ಸ್ ಕೊಡ್ಬೋದು. ಅದೇ ರೀತಿ ಇನ್ಫ್ಲುಯೆನ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಆರ್ಕಿಟೆಕ್ಚರ್ ಬರೀಬೋದು ನಾನು, ಅದೇ ರೀತಿ ಲಿಟರೇಚರ್ ಬರೀಬೋದು ನಾನು, ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ಸ್ ಕೊಡ್ಬೋದು. ಬಟ್ ಇಫ್ ಯು ಆರ್ ಗಿವಿಂಗ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಜಿಮ್, ವೇರ್ ಇಸ್ ಎವಿಡೆನ್ಸ್? If I'm talking about some, it is ಯಾವ್ದೊಂದು ಪಾಪ್ ಮ್ಯೂಸಿಕ್ ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ವೇರ್ ಇಸ್ ದ ಎವಿಡೆನ್ಸ್? Yes or no? Yes or no? It is automatically the mix of cultures ashtadu. It's not a Western concept, rather it's a mix of the cultures. Yeah, classic na matte it is, we call it as the Western concept na ಎರಡು mix ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ it is pop. Yes or no? Yes. Next one, influences external. Now external influence example ಕೊಡ್ತೀರಾ? Now sir, ಈ influence ಇಂದ which has brought major changes. Which has brought major changes. The external influence majorly via the concept called as the Christian missionaries. Via the concept called as, how do you know? Via the concept of Christian missionaries. Example, via the Christian missionaries. Nee one really try ಮಾಡಿ at least. Okay, Christian missionaries ಆಯ್ತು. It is industrialization and a concept of urbanization. It is a concept of industrial revolution, industrialization, as well as urbanization. Has been taken up from Melinda. It's influence from the West. Influence from the West. Yes. Next one. It is inculcation. Now, what inculcation? It is inculcation of the Western, the processes. Inculcation of the Western, the process. Inculcation of Western, the process. Sir, what process, sir? And the ಕೇಳಿದ್ರೆ what process? It is with respect to luxury, with respect to luxuriness. Second one, the process called as individual liberty. Concept called as individual liberty. You last one, even fill ಮಾಡಿ. ನಂಗೆ ಮೇಬಿ ಹೇಳಬೇಕು, ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ ಇಲ್ವೋ? ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿರಿ ಹೇಳಿ, ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ ಬಟ್ ಅದ್ರ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. Third one, it is the third one, we call it as the concept of the rights also. The concept of rights has been influenced, or the process has been inculcated even in the Indian society also. See, 80% of Indian constitution is borrowed from West, or I can say 100%. Yes or no? That is the influence of, I can say, Westernization on Indian societies. ಈಗ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಂವಿಧಾನನೇ ಇನ್ಫ್ಲುಯೆನ್ಸ್ ಆಗಿದೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಆಟೋಮ್ಯಾಟಿಕಲಿ the laws will also get influenced. The laws will also get influenced. ಸರ್ ನೆಗೆಟಿವ್ ಆಗಿ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ನೆಗೆಟಿವ್ ಆಗಿ ಏನಾದ್ರು ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕು, ಇನ್ಕಲ್ಕೇಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿದೀವಿ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಹೌದು, ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಕಾಲ್ಡ್ ಆಸ್ ಕೊಲೋನಿಯಲ್ ಆಟಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್, ದ ಕೊಲೋನಿಯಲ್ ಮೈಂಡ್ ಸೆಟ್. ಕೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಕೊಲೋನಿಯಲ್ ಆಟಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್, ಕೊಲೋನಿಯಲ್ ಮೈಂಡ್ ಸೆಟ್ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಏನು? Nothing but it is, we call it as exploitative behavior. Second one, we call it as working in the interest of few than all. The third one, we call it as delays. ಅನ್ನೋದು ಯಾರಿಂದ ತಗೊಂಡಿರೋದು ನಾವಲ್ಲಿ? Colonial masters. Delays or red tapeism, all the things has been taken up from, we call it as from our colonial masters. Okay now, and the last one we call it as outcome. What's the outcome here? Now the outcome here is, we call it as, the outcome here is dominant culture, inculcation of the dominant culture, the tradition, the belief systems, the attitude, for by principles, all these things we call it as dominant culture. Now what is the dominant culture here? It is Westernization. The dominant culture we call it as Westernization. Okay now, it is the dominant culture we call it as Westernization. Okay now, yes, this is about the salient features. The next one we call it as, what are the positives of Westernization and what are the positives or the negatives of the Westernization? Beine, parpidanda, fast again. First one, and begin on 8 point, ticket on 5, akada on 5. Okay, first one, rational thinking will start to increase. Okay, it is diverse, and the occupations has diversified. Perfect, yes. And professionalism in occupation also brought in. Professionalism followed by, we call it as profession. Occupational diversity has increased. Okay, very good. Third, I thought already. ಒಂದು 5 ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಹೇಳಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ವಾ ಪಾಸಿಟಿವ್ಸ್? ಥಿಂಕ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಒನ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಕಲ್ಚರ್, ಒನ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಪಾಲಿಟಿ, ಒನ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಎಕನಾಮಿಕ್ಸ್, ಒನ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ರಿಲಿಜನ್, ಒನ್ ಫ್ರಮ್, ವಿ ಕಾಲ್ ಇಟ್ ಆಸ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಷನ್, ಆರ್ ಒನ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಎಥಿಕ್ಸ್. It is equity and concept of equality. Now ಅದೆಲ್ಲ ಗ್ರೂಪ್ ಆಗಿ, can I say constitutional morality has originated? ಮುಗಿತಿ, ಏನು ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಡಿ ಅದನ್ನ. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಆಗಿ it is superstitious beliefs has come down. Perfect, yes. Nothing but, can I talk about the social reforms has evolved? The social reforms, ಎಲ್ಲದನ್ನ ಸೇರಿಸಿ I am introducing a term called as, it is the social reforms took place. Now social reforms in the form of establishment of egalitarian society. What's egalitarian andre? Equal societies. Egalitarian societies took place. Egalitarian societies took place. Okay. Second one, one from polity na nodadadre, one from polity we call it as the constitutional morality. Morality andre naitikate. It is constitutional value systems got increased. Now what do you mean by constitutional morality andre? It is constitutional morality which includes concept of justice, concept of equality, concept of rights, concept of thought process, concept of fraternity. All this concept has been inculcated from the West. Even the concept of secularism also has been inculcated from the West. The concept of secularism. The second one from polity. Society in the polity in the one, the economic in the nee veldange, it is the profession and professionalism has brought in, or we call it as diversity of what? Now diversity of occupation ingappa barutte, with increase in industrialization, with increase in urbanization, with increase in industrialization, with increase in urbanization, I will get employment outside my villages, outside my Jajmani system. I'll get employment outside my Jajmani system. How do you know? Nothing that if I am the lower caste people, or if I am from lower caste community, don't you think I'll be exploited? Why the concept called as Jajmani system? But in another escape agbeku nanu ಏನು alternative option ಇದೆ? Nothing but I need to get employment outside my village. And outside my village employment sigbeku antandre there must be industries, there must be urbanization. Now industries and urbanization has been introduced by yarappa antandre, we call it as Britishers. We call it as the Westernization or the colonial masters. Yes, it is diversity of occupation will take place. And the fourth one we call it as, fourth one, no, Begin one with respect to, we call it as the religion, and the last one we call it as one from ethics, or we'll go for some one science and technology. Okay, technology ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಡ. Science and technology. Now, what can be the it is positives of Westernization with respect to it is technology? Nothing but innovative thinking, merit-based decision making. It is, we call it as in inculcate aitappa innovation followed by rational decision making, followed by it is data center policy will start to take place. It is based on data, will be deciding it. Nothing but based on merit of the case. Exactly, yes. Yes, Matad Bolu. Aramagi. Now, what about religion? Now, religious reforms are also being brought in. It is religious reforms are also being brought in. Not only social reforms, the religious reforms are also being brought in. Now, what do you mean by religious reforms, Sandra? Now, religious reforms concept called as go back to Vedas. Go back to, it is the Vedas, the concept has been given by Yaro. It is Dayananda Saraswati's concept of Arya Samaj. The concept of Arya Samaj, go back to Vedas. So within religion also, there has been reformation. Took place. Okay, now, you got negatives. The house Westernization brought in negatives. The first one we call it as degradation of our own culture will take place. Now, our own culture is yadu. It is degradation of the Indian culture. The degradation of Indian culture will take place. Degradation of Indian culture will take place. Next. It is, sir, how going back to Vedas is an influence from the West? How Dayananda concept of it is going back to Vedas or protecting my own culture. Now, don't you think with education, we got our awareness? Now, awareness in the, it is, we are talking about what? We are talking about protecting my own culture. Awareness degradation, why will I go for conservation? Take an example of ASI, again, Archaeological Survey of India, which has been established majorly because of the influence of West to conserve or protect the traditional cultures. Or we call it as, it is the age-old cultures is being protected. How do you know? For example, take an example of conservation protection of the Halmidi inscription. Can I discuss more there? Now, Halmidi inscription, don't you think with education, I won't be conserving this? And the Halmidi and the Gotagli na in martide. But the other money cuts. Yes, I would have used this stone for either it is Payago or for the stones. I would have used it. But with English education or with literature, with it is awareness, I'm going for rationality. I'm going for conservation. I'm going for protection also. Yes? Exactly. Yes. Article 49 and Article 49, we call it as liberal intellectual alone. Liberal intellectual concept. Again, it has been brought in from, it is West. Okay, first one, Indian culture will get impacted. Second one, second negative challenges. It is more, I can see, it is the more materialism or consumerism behavior has increased. Correct, Alva? The more materialistic beliefs, the cultural beliefs are being given more priority. Adadmele. The third one, we call it as identity crisis. It is how come an identity crisis will take place? Identity crisis andre ಏನು? Nothing but ನಮ್ಮ culture ನಮ್ಗೆ ಏನು ಉಳಿಸೇ ಇಲ್ವಲ್ಲ. Nothing but we have, I can say, inculcated all the concepts of West. It is all the concepts of West. Now, identity crisis will also take place. Now, think that it is saying that if a person is moving from India to the USA, and he has stayed for some 50 years in the West. Now, 50 ವರ್ಷ ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಉಳ್ಕೊಂಡು ಮತ್ತೆ ವಾಪಸ್ ಬಂದ್ರೆ will he be having any identity to live in India? His culture is lost, his values are lost, the principles are lost, as well as he'll be losing his own citizenship also, alva. Nothing but the identity crisis will also take place because of the impact we call it as Westernization, because of impact of Westernization. Idur jotege environmental destruction will also take place. Now, how environmental destruction will take place? Because focusing more on industrialization, urbanization, and profit-oriented motive. The profit-oriented motive. The last one, can I talk about? It is minorities or the marginalized sections gets neglected here. Yes or no? It is minorities. Example kodtira. Minorities or marginalized sections gets impacted. It is the concept of slums will start to increase. Perfect. Concept of the slums will start to increase. The concept of, we call it as different social evils, because of conflict will start to increase. Social evils like corruption increase agatem. Whereby we call it as conflict like terrorism, conflict like Naxalism will start to increase because of what? Because of clashes between the traditional cultures as well as it is modernity. Because of impact of marginalized sections. Don't you think they'll raise a banner against the majoritarian? How they'll raise a voice against the majoritarianism, and that we call it as increase in terrorism will start to increase in corruption will start to increase in Naxalism will also start to increase. Because to raise a voice against the government and to get the benefits, and the social levels will start to increase. I think what slums increase agaten, followed by environmental degradation, marginalized communities get impacted, followed by our cultural erosion will take place. Identity crisis is also the challenge of Westernization.